Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Indigenous Research Spotlight session of Research Week. We wish to acknowledge that the campuses of Algoma University are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Cree, and the Mushkegowuk Cree, as well as hereditary lands of the Métis Nation. We also acknowledge that many of us are joining from Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, home of the Garden River and Batchewana First Nations, on sacred lands set aside for education as envisioned by Chief Shigmock for our children and for those as yet unborn. As today's session is being held virtually, we would also like to acknowledge all the Indigenous nations across Turtle Island, whose lands and territories we are each situated on. I will go through a bit of housekeeping. This session will be recorded and will be linked to the auresearchweek.com website under the Research Spotlight section. Participant cameras and microphones are off. Only hosts and panelists have camera and mic access. If you run into any audio issues during the webinar, please try another method of listening, such as computer audio or calling in by phone. The chat and Q&A functions have been disabled at this time. After each presentation, we will re-enable the Q&A so that our audience can participate. We will follow up on questions as time permits. Otherwise, a follow-up email will be shared. Live captions are included. And if you are a member of the media, please reach out via chat to set up an interview with our speakers or the Office of Research. I am now going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll ask that our first presenter go ahead and set up your slide deck while I introduce her. We are pleased to present two researchers today who are both fairly new to the Algoma University community. Presenting first today will be Dr. Elaine Ho-Tassone. Elaine is currently a postdoctoral fellow in biology and a part-time faculty member at Algoma University. She is currently teaching a course on interdisciplinary approaches. Please welcome Dr. Elaine Ho-Tassone with her presentation, Intercultural Collaborations, a Settler's Lessons Learned.
Thank you, Tiffany, and for everyone else at Research Week for sharing everything that is going on. It's fascinating to see the breadth and diversity of the things that are happening at Algoma University. It makes me excited to be here. I do want to first acknowledge International Women's Day and give a shout out to all the amazing women and also the gentlemen who are allying with strengthening equality across the planet. I also want to mention that I am not Indigenous, and so although this work is interculturally collaborative, I am presenting only on behalf of my own perspectives and what I have learned from these interactions. And so my research focuses on freshwater monitoring, which integrates both the sciences and the social sciences as I consider the ecological and human aspects of a water system. And so this photo is from one of the two projects that I will be discussing today. And in it, you see me on the left, and in the center is Maggie Lesage, who was our former Garden River First Nation community coordinator for the project. And on the right is Joni McGuffin, who is the executive director of the Lake Superior Watershed Conservancy. And so this photo captures a lot about our projects together, including the engagement of the community at a large scale, which I'll be talking about a little bit as I go through the project, and also the building of intercultural relationships and relationships with different nations and organizations and people that in many cases continue today and are continuing into the next few years with different proposals, even though the project ended last month. So this presentation highlights two projects as mentioned. It focuses on Western knowledge, as the lead researcher is Western, being myself. So I will start with research from my PhD studies at the lower right, which involved Ho-Tassone youth from the Six Nations of the Grand River First Nation. This sub-project was part of a larger 5-year multi-method project under Global Water Futures, which represents the largest university-led investment in freshwater research in history. Then I will describe a community-led research partnership with the Lands and Resources Department at the Garden River First Nation, which is at the top left. And then I will conclude with some lessons learned. So it's important to recognize the different identities within each of these projects before I go into what we actually did. So the first project involved Haudenosaunee youth, and the second Anishinaabe youth and adults from Garden River First Nation. And so as such, I do want to acknowledge that the approaches and the expectations or ethics of research will vary at each nation and in each community as well. So what is shared here in my presentation is not necessarily applicable everywhere. Just want to make a note of that. So these maps I'm going to be using to show you the locations of the two projects that will be discussed. And I also want to highlight a couple of other features here. First, the Six Nations of the Grand River is First Nation is located on the eastern basin of Lake Erie. And of course, we know where Garden River is, I hope, up here. And so I do want to point out that although we see the treaty territories on the right-hand side here, on the left side, you will see the traditional territories all overlapping, including over the waters, and you don't really see that as much on the right. So I want to acknowledge that the areas in which these projects took place are the traditional territories of many peoples, in particular the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples, as well as the locations of many different agreements, including the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, the Tuwa Wampum, and the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. So I think we are familiar with the Robinson Hero Treaty territory. That's the purple area on the top, on the right there, on the right side. If we look at the lower down here, well, you'll kind of see a purpley strip, and that is the Haldimand Tract, which is 6 miles or 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River, which is Southern Ontario's largest river system. And so these are the contexts in which the projects occur within. So we'll start with a look at the PhD research in Southern Ontario, which was co-created with Music for the Spirit and Indigenous Visual Arts. This is an after-school program for young people at Six Nations of the Grand River First Nation. It is generally designed for school-aged students, but as the youth get older, they continue with the program as mentors for younger students, even beyond their school years. So the purpose of this project was to bring forward different perspectives that are not usually heard by water managers. And so this was one of a couple of different community-based research case studies that was undertaken as part of my PhD to explore how community members, both Canadian and Indigenous, can be engaged by water managers in the area to bring forward different types of knowledge, different perspectives, different priorities. And this is because Haudenosaunee voices should be invited due to their authority within the Haldimand Tract in this Grand River watershed, but are not often invited as a result of managers' discomfort with the idea of, I don't really know what processes to use. I don't know if I'm going to say something that's going to be offensive and then I'm not going to be able to work with them anymore. Like there's a lot of personal I guess, mental blockages in a way with a lot of the managers. And so we were striving to demonstrate that, you know what, if you actually just take the time to work with people, it actually, you can figure it out and it doesn't have to be some super formal, scary thing. And here are some examples. So the method we used, of course, as should be used in a lot of community contexts, was co-creation. And the efforts were led and steered in this project by me because it was a piece of the PhD research that was, the research was not meant to be Indigenous research, quote unquote. This is research with Indigenous partners. And so the Western component was in the PhD, the main narrative that was being explored. Through this collaboration, began in August 2019, it was preceded by discussions and relationship building with the community's then wildlife manager as of July 2018. So there were about 18 months of relationship building that was undertaken prior to beginning anything in regards to ideation, forming an actual process, nothing like this. So for about 18 months, all I did was talk to people and understand what the interests might be and how this might look and what processes might be undertaken. And then we started forming what the partnership might actually look like. This project resulted in qualitative analyses only, and this was using a grounded theory approach in which the main themes and ideas that come out of the perspective shared kind of emerged as the analysis took place. There were no predetermined categories or anything like that going into this work. So what we ended up doing was engaging the youth in various artistic activities to create a space in which they could represent their relationships with water using different artistic media, which we'll look at in a second. And these were coupled with short write-ups to facilitate the interpretation of their contributions. So of course, in the interest of reciprocity, I asked the youth coordinators what they would like me to do to support the youth who were contributing to my research. And their response was that they wanted the youth in the after school program to have some kind of voice that would be heard beyond the walls of the community center at which they met. So they wanted to be able to reach out, not just within their community, but beyond their community as well, to share their perspectives. And so I curated a traveling art exhibit that would span 5 cities over 6 months from March to August 2020. And this poster you see here was put out after the initial event. So the first event wasn't on there, and there were also some events that were added after this. So this is an incomplete poster. But due to the novel coronavirus, we were only able to exhibit at our first location at the Carolinian Cafe in Cayuga, Ontario. And after that, we ended up turning the exhibit into a virtual tour, which was then used in the second year ecology class of about 200 students at the University of Waterloo, and which was eventually displayed on tablets at the museum, is what it's called, which is Canada's largest cultural museum in the Waterloo region. And we also published many articles in the Grey Literature to amplify the youth's voices, which attracted attention from a dozen countries or more. And we also now have finally submitted a manuscript to the Journal of Great Lakes Research, which we're hoping to have accepted in a special issue on bringing different knowledges together. So that's one example. And here are some examples of the different artworks and the media that the youth used. So there were drawings, paintings, digital artwork. There were hybrid collages. So the top right corner was a cut and paste collage that was then manipulated using software on the computer. There was beadwork, photography, and also painting of cultural objects like paddles and drums. And as mentioned, accompanying text was also provided in most cases, not in all cases. And so the relationships described incorporated a great many topics from, as you can probably see here, from recreation to drinking water, and from cultural teachings to plastic pollutions. And there was even a special section on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit persons. And all of this connected to the ways in which these young people connect and the freshwater system in their area. So a lot of the questions that we received from the managers that we spoke with were, what do we do with information like this? You know, we're used to using spreadsheets and quantitative data when it comes to water quality monitoring and making decisions on the issues that seem to arise based on what the data tell us. So what do you do with this kind of material? One thing that we did, and there are many ways to go about this, but one thing that we did was we pulled themes and recommendations that we identified from the perspective shared by the youth. And these were used to create an initial list of 16 principles and values that were intended to guide decision-making and the development of any future monitoring in the region. So these main themes, similar main themes, were also identified from another phase of the research in which 21 current or recent water managers and scientists were interviewed. And so from that phase of the research, we created a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, with accompanying recommendations. And there were over 150 of these analysis points and the recommendations that went with them. And then what we did was, using the youth's perspectives as a foundation, we then pulled from the interviews themes and added these to the list of initial 16 principles and values, and then synthesized them all so that all the perspectives could be represented in a more succinct and digestible way. And so a short list of 10 principles and values was then created that summarized everything. So I'll go through these fairly briefly because there is a lot of material that we produced on these, and I'm happy to discuss these further with anyone who is interested. And these are intentionally not numbered because they're not meant to have any sort of hierarchy or order, but I will go through them quickly for you. So the first is that water is essential and finite, which I think is fairly self-explanatory. Recognizing that what we put into the watershed returns to us in one form or another. So that old mentality of the solution to pollution is dilution is intended to not be carried forward in these recommendations. impacts are shared but not equally distributed. And so we recognize that there are a lot of common issues that people face around the world, even when it comes to issues around fresh water, whether it be flooding or drought or an unreliable access to clean drinking water, waterborne diseases, all these kinds of things. But the impacts, even though they're common across the planet, are not equally distributed. And we want to make sure that we're recognizing this in the decisions and the planning that we carry out. We are inextricably embedded within ecosystems and are codependent in many ways. And so the conventional approach of removing the water manager as an external intervener is not something that is sustainable to carry forward in terms of both the ecosystem and the social context that exists in the region. Partnerships and collaboration are the foundation of program implementation. This is not a truth of this is somewhat of a truth actually of the current program, but is not fully inclusive of diverse partnerships. And so this is more of a recommendation that any partnerships and collaborations moving forward should be broad, diverse, and inclusive, and should be the foundation of any monitoring or management program implementation. We also openly acknowledge diversity, histories, and strive to reconcile. And we recognize and value diverse relationships between water and people. And so this really speaks to the idea of plurality in terms of there's not one single truth, and there's different ways to look at things and interpret things. And also that different people experience water and experience their relationship with the environment at large in different ways. And that requires different approaches in terms of engagement, behavioral changes, in terms of how we understand and interpret problems in the area, as well as what needs to be addressed and prioritizing those issues. Data and communication are open, transparent, and accessible. Again, this is a recommendation more than a truth of the area. Cultural and intergenerational knowledge are also expected to be recognized as data. And intergenerational knowledge, actually, I'll go back one point there, speaks not just to the Indigenous community, but this came out of a lot of our community member at large, including Canadian community members' recommendations too, because there were a lot of people who live in the area for several generations, and they have memories, they've got photographs, they've got memoirs and things, that journals that their grandparents and great-grandparents wrote, or stories that have been told about the fish that you used to see in the area and what the conditions used to be like. And these are not recognized at this time. And so this is something that is a common recommendation, not just with our Indigenous youth, but other community members as well. The expectation is that we will manage as stewards, which means that waters are treated as living sentient beings with love, respect, and gratitude, as you would hope from any person interacting with a human as well. We recognize that iterative adaptive processes do not fail, but they improve, and proactive precautionary approaches are applied when feasible. And this speaks to the I suppose, overly cautious approach of many of the water scientists and managers in the region today, and I would argue elsewhere as well, where people are afraid to enter into any processes that are new to them because they're not sure how it's going to turn out, and it's viewed as a failure if it doesn't work out the way you expect. But the youth in this particular project actually said, well, no, we want to try new things, and if things don't work out the way that you expect, then we learn from it. So it's a continual improvement thing. It's not a one-time get it right and that's it sort of thing. So they wanted to highlight that as well. And finally, that managers should strive to measure and enhance community experiences as part of their assessment of watershed health. So there is a difference between water health and watershed health, and the same thing with water management and watershed management. So the watershed incorporates all the land as well and everybody in it that is part of that watershed, and the watershed is generally defined as all the water in an area draining to a specific point. So anyone in that region where that water will drain to a specific river or lake, for example, is included in that watershed, as well as all the animals and plants and everything that happens in there. So if you're looking at a social ecological system in terms of management, then you should be looking at all of those factors when you're trying to assess different things through science, through whatever methods that you're using. So the second context is near us, and it is at the Garden River First Nation Lands Department, led by the Lands Department. This wrapped up last month and was the main component of my postdoctoral research at Algoma University. So the purpose of this project was fourfold. First, to build water monitoring capacity in the community, Second, to determine feasibility of community water monitoring, because there are some questions around how reliable or valid are the data when community members who are not as experienced with certain methods are the ones doing the data collection. Third was build relationships across the region, both within and outside of Indigenous communities or nations, and also to develop youth leadership at the Garden River First Nation. So of course, we again co-created this from the very start. Efforts were led and steered by members of the First Nation, originally by the chief, and then staff at the Lands Department. And we largely took a quantitative analysis in this project. First, we looked at an a combination of online data portal and descriptive statistics. So we had students looking at descriptive stats to summarize the kind of trends that we saw. But we also looked at an online data portal that I'm going to show you in a moment that helped us to visualize the different trends that we were seeing in a way that was easy to understand the implications of it. And I will show you what I mean in just a moment. And then, of course, we also looked at the numbers of different insects found in different locations. So we did 2 surveys of the little bugs that live in the water. And those can tell us what is going on in the water system based on how many of what kind of bugs and things that we find. This was highly partnered. And so the main partners of this were, of course, Nordic Institute, which at Algoma University, which is where I've kind of framed my role as the researcher. We, of course, had Garden River First Nation as the core partner who basically led a lot of the implementation of the actual project. Waterlution, Gordon Foundation, and Water Rangers all supported the project in various ways. For example, Swim Drink Fish, I'm going to kind of focus on them because they did add on to our project at the end of it to provide a bunch more funding and in-kind support to also set up a laboratory facility for E. coli testing at the First Nation. So now the First Nation has its own laboratory equipment for testing E. coli in the water that can be used by other First Nations in the area as well, instead of having to rely on Western or colonial government authorities. And the project as a whole was also designed so that increasing power and control is given to the community. And so my role as a researcher started off as more of a kind of a project manager, just facilitating the connections and making sure everything was being implemented as needed, doing a little bit of the training, and then moved into really just helping where needed and when asked and nothing more. So I don't have any decision-making authority about anything that happens with this program and never really did throughout the project, unless asked, of course, to consult. And this is an intentional kind of design of planned obsolescence in terms of researcher involvement in the project, although of course the relationships continue. So in this project, we used freshwater explorer test kits that were provided by Water Rangers, and that's what you see at the center top image there, which allowed us to measure 10 parameters directly. And these were air and water temperature, alkalinity, chlorine, hardness, pH, and conductivity, as well as dissolved oxygen and water clarity, which is also known as Secchi depth. And then, of course, the actual sampling depth. So we would measure where we took the sample from. In addition, we converted conductivity into a measure of total dissolved solids so that we had that parameter as well. And over 15 weeks, we collected 1,067 data points that were recorded from 7 sites in the reserve territory. And as mentioned, we also surveyed benthic invertebrates at 2 locations. And so by looking at those invertebrates, we can also add a biological or a living perspective of water quality to supplement the chemistry data, and 541 little buggies were tallied. And so the reason for that is that we can look at the actual chemical parameters of the water, but we don't necessarily know how that manifests in terms of impacts on the things that live in it. And so the benthic environment, that's the stream bed, essentially the rocks, the sand that are at the bottom of the waters, those critters that live there are in many ways a foundation of the entire system. And so the health of those insects and the community structure or the kinds of mixes of bugs that we find really are telling of how much other life they can support in that system. And so this is what I was talking about with the data visualization, the online portal. This is an area of the Great Lakes data stream portal that is zoomed into our region up here on the top left there. The Great Lakes data stream launched last fall. So this is a fairly new tool, and it launched with over 7 million data points collected across the Great Lakes Basin from both Canada and the US. And this portal is regularly maintained and is automated so that it includes any new data as well that are added to any of the hundreds of data sets that feed into this system. So you don't have to manually go in and input data into the data stream. It automatically speaks to all the different databases from government and any non-government bodies that contribute to it, so that it gets updated as soon as their systems get updated. Each point that you see on the map is a water monitoring site, either current or historical. And in our region, most of these points are historical, having been reduced since probably the early 80s, when government investment in water quality and general conservation had decreased heavily. So as mentioned previously, we have 7 monitoring sites in the region, which you can see in closer detail on this overlay here, this little box that's on the top right. This is from the Water Rangers online data portal. And because we use Water Rangers test kits to actually do the measuring, we use their mobile app to log the data that are collected. It just works a little bit easier that way. And then these data are then automatically updated into the data stream, which is where we go to visualize trends over time. And so if you go into the data stream, click on any of these points, you'll see our program name, it's the Garden River First Nation Community-Based Water Monitoring Program. You'll click on it, it'll open up a little screen that looks kind of like this. This is only part of the screen, it's not the whole screen. And you'll see the name of the monitoring organization or program that you, at the top here, you can download the data or send it as an attachment. And you'll see all the different sites, which we've written some codes, but also written the common names of those locations, as well as the data range. And then over here, you can look at which characteristics. So this is an image or a snapshot of dissolved oxygen data that we collected over, that was actually our entire monitoring period for last year, the 15 weeks. And then you can also see in the top right corner, CCME, this is freshwater guidelines on it's ... here. So that is the Canadian Council of Ministers for the Environment. And this is a national standard of limits of certain things, whether it's dissolved oxygen or certain contaminants for fresh water. And they have all kinds of guidelines that you can drop down and select what you'd like to compare it against. So as you can see, many of the data points actually fall below the recommended levels for a healthy ecosystem. And it varies depending on, in this case, different life cycles of different fish. So you have cold water biota, early life stage, cold water, other life stage, warm water early, and warm water other life stages. So many of our points are kind of hovering on the border there, and then a lot of them actually fall below, at least from these 2 sites. You can see if there's different colors that you can see the colors. 2 of the sites were consistently below all of the recommended limits for dissolved oxygen. So both of these data portals are online and free for anyone to access, and it basically provides anybody with a real-time snapshot of the state of the water around them. And so the use of these data portals is actually a really key part of this work. So I do want to focus on this for just one moment to speak about why we use it and why I would strongly suggest this kind of thing for programs moving forward, similar programs. First, it helps to coordinate efforts across a region so that people are collecting data, similar kinds of data in different locations, so that we can actually tell a narrative across a watershed, for example. It helps to identify opportunities for collaboration. So you can actually look at any of those data points and click on it, and it'll show you who is doing it, who is doing the monitoring for that. And so you can actually see who's doing what in your region, which is actually really challenging to try and figure out if you don't have a tool like this in place. There are tons of opportunities for education, whether you're bringing them into the classroom for analyses or playing around with different trends and looking at different locations at different times of year, as well as being a good source of information for young professionals or water managers or even community members who are trying to understand what, if they've seen a warning or something in their community, they want to know what nitrates are, what that means, or where are the safe levels, and then what are the actual levels near me. That helps people with that. Of course, we're hoping there's going to be a management response. That's kind of the idea behind collecting this data, is that if something comes up, for example, the low dissolved oxygen, then we can say, okay, well, now we know there's a problem, let's do something about it, and then take some kind of action to correct the issue. There's also a component of democratization, and this is especially true in our context in the Indigenous nations, but also just across society, where communities and First Nations have a better opportunity or better ability to advocate for their own self-determination when they have the information basically to support any arguments or demands for certain actions or things like that, as well as awareness of just what's happening around you and that can affect your health and the well-being of everyone who lives in the area, right? So there are different reasons why I've kind of categorized all this under democratization, but I'll leave it at that for the sake of time. And then, of course, there's also the ethics piece, which I have a feeling Dr. Torres is going to speak to in a few minutes, so I won't go too far into it. But I do want to recognize the OCAP principles from the First Nations Information Governance Center, and that's the principles of ownership, control, access, and possession. And so the decision to put the data on this online portal was not my decision. It was the decision of the Garden River First Nation Lands Department. And the idea was that providing this data would allow community members to then be more involved and actively engaged in various activities in the community. And so that was a decision that was made by them to ensure that they had the ability to share and to engage with people and point people to something. But you'll also see there was something in the menu there where you can click and look at the data license, and there's a license note in there that states that any use of this data is allowed, but must credit the Garden River First Nation Lands and Resources Department for ownership of that data, and any questions and any discussion of the data should go through them. And so it's just another way of supporting the ethical use and generation of information in partnership with First Nations communities. So beyond the water quality data, we also undertook a lot of other activities. First, you can see in some of the photos here, we engaged in some capacity building, which was done through, at the top, you can see the top images there, staff and team training. This was a benthic invertebrate survey that I went through with them. On the left, you can see Maggie, our coordinator at the time. She was doing some presentations at a youth cultural camp over the summer last year. So we did engage with the members of the community through presentations like this, holding booths at events like the powwow, things like that, as well as inviting members of the community to come out and join the sampling activities. We had a couple of people from the community come out to join in and see how it's done and what the story is. And we also held several meetings and online events, including with the leadership of the community and offering a youth training on how to promote messages and stories on social media. One of two culminating events was a community presentation that included conversations about cultural knowledge of water, as well as the scientific findings of this project. And this had more than 150 registrants and about 100 attendees from across North America. It had a pretty wide reach, which we were actually surprised about, but pretty pleased to see. And then we also held a final event that was a regional meeting with more than 20 government and non-government organizations and 6 Indigenous nations to consider opportunities for improved collaboration and coordination on water activities across the Twin Saults. This is kind of the region around here. And this event had 62 registrants and 48 attendees. So those are just some of the examples of ways in which we had conversations, and it goes beyond just simple, what is the data, what is the scientific component of this? You have to engage with the people side of things in order to actually have decision making done the way we need it to be done, engage decision makers in these kinds of activities to understand the context of the information that is being developed, because the context, again, is so important in a lot of ways. So I'll go through a couple of project outcomes and next steps, and then some lessons learned. On my part, the theoretical research continues until June to explore opportunities for two-eyed seeing and community-derived data in water governance. And two-eyed seeing is essentially a Mi'kmaq principle or concept in which you bring the best of what Western knowledge has to offer and bring it together with the best of what Indigenous knowledge has to offer. From my partner's perspectives, the data from this pilot project contributes to a baseline understanding of the conditions in the Garden River and St. Mary's River. The project also provided short-term and contract work for numerous individuals, including 3 Garden River community members, 2 Algoma University students, and a high school co-op student, as well as the various community volunteers who came out during the weekly sampling. Feedback from the community will contribute to continued monitoring, and they're going to be developing a more kind of fully fledged version of this program, including the E. coli monitoring for this year that will be implemented. It's going to be a full-scale program. and working relationships were developed with the project partners that are continuing past the life of this pilot. And so this is an increase in capacity in the community to be able to address many different needs, not just the needs of the project, and not just within the project lifespan. Some of the recommendations that I have learned are going to be discussed here. And again, a word of caution, as mentioned at the start of the talk, these lessons are often specific to their context and to the people who learned or taught them. So again, there may be some different perspectives in the audience members here, but I'm hoping that this might be useful to some of us. So first, I'll start with the advice from my collaborators, and these are the things that they've come up with that they'd like to hear promoted. And I did invite some of our collaborators to come out and chat with us today, but unfortunately, due to limited capacities, they were not able to, hence this piece that I'm about to share with you. First, to recognize the validity of all sources of knowledge and ownership of that knowledge, and similarly recognize or respect the stories and remember which are yours to tell. And so a lot of the information that came out of this project, and just in speaking about a project that is not, that I don't consider to be my project, I helped facilitate it, but it's not my project. I did ensure that these slides and the speaker's notes were shared with Garden River First Nation prior to making this presentation, so that the work is presented in a way that is acceptable to the people who own it. You want to seek funding and partnerships that will fund full-time contracts, including beyond the project life. And creating shared spaces that ensure community needs dictate the project intent, action, outcomes from the very start. So if we think about inclusivity, that often involves inviting people to a space that was not designed for their active and meaningful participation, and that can impede people from being able to contribute. And so the idea is to create a shared environment of some kind, and the Grand Expressions art exhibit was one example where we basically said, okay, well, what is an appropriate way, a culturally appropriate way to engage with young people, to share their perspectives, in what formats, and in a way that others can also understand it and receive it in a positive way. And we came up with that art exhibit. You want to make sure you're funding honoraria for volunteers and community participation of any kind. And this was really driven home at that last meeting on February 16th with a lot of the water managers and scientists from the region. The point being that in-kind and volunteer contributions really are a privilege. They are something that privileged organizations and people are able to do. And despite best interest, a lot of individuals and organizations who are not of the more commonly privileged category are not able to contribute this kind of time and other contributions. And so it should never be an expectation in developing projects with Indigenous communities or others who are not as high capacity as others. And speaking of that, First Nations do have capacity. We want to recognize the immense knowledge and abilities and skills that exist, but funding is often the thing that is needed. And so just keeping that in mind, that you know, these partners don't need continual teaching and training and education, quote unquote, but they do need support to be able to pursue their own approaches and methods for pursuing or for influencing change and addressing issues. So a couple of do's and don'ts, and these are primarily for non-Indigenous researchers who want to work with Indigenous researchers, so people like myself, but it could also apply, some of these anyway, could apply to Indigenous persons as well who are working with people who are especially not of their nation and who are working cross-culturally. So do first recognize your own ignorance and take responsibility for your own education, and I promote this a lot. It is not the Indigenous person's responsibility to educate you about their context. You need to take it upon yourself to explore that. And that doesn't mean you can't ask questions, but don't put the onus on the other person. Do ensure consent is established and collaborative ideation occurs from the start and is maintained. You can't assume that that consent continues. Do deliver on commitments and reciprocate. Co-create and build capacity as much as possible and in ways that are requested or of interest to your partners. Do create shared spaces. Do question your worldview and, for example, whose ethics apply? And this comes, for example, from my PhD work where I had an ethics application in which, of course, through the university ethics review process, and the reviewer was really kind of stuck on, she wanted to see written consent provided by the parents of underage youth for participation in the project. However, the parents were adamant about specifically not signing the paperwork because this community is one of the most researched Indigenous communities in Canada, and written agreements don't really mean much to the parents who I was involved with. What they were more interested in was developing actual relationships with me as a researcher in person over time, and they wanted implied consent in the sense that they wanted their students, their kids to attend and participate, but in bringing their children to the activities, that was their version of consent, right? And so eventually that worked out fine, but it took a little bit of negotiation with the ethics reviewer. Don't assume you know what is needed, and engage early, because investment exists whether you recognize it or not. And so there are generally always going to be people who you didn't know you need to communicate with or consult with or engage with. And you need to make sure that there is time and capacity for fully participating in those activities and speaking with everyone and bringing forth those perspectives, whether or not you knew they were going to be there. Don't justify inclusion, do justify exclusion. I had recently a question from a land trust group asking if we should partner with certain people or engage with certain organizations. And I was saying to them, is there a specific reason why you shouldn't? And they're like, no. I said, well, then go talk to people. You want to bring people together as much as possible and involve people. You don't want to keep siloing everyone into specific categories and determining what their roles in their society should be for them. Don't forget the importance of context, especially when collaborating interculturally. And this I've spoken about a couple of times, so I'll leave that at that. So I'm almost at the end here. I know my time is just about up. Just a couple of quick guiding questions as you develop your research that may be helpful. Ask yourself, does the project ideation put the community or partner at the forefront? Are their needs first? Was consent given prior to the project development, and how will you assess continued consent or deal with potential withdrawal of consent, which is always a real thing? Are the processes present to engage and designed with, not just for, those participants? Do partners and participants have the capacity to meaningfully participate? And this could mean a lot of different things. How are we identifying who represents diverse views, and do these groups know this process or representation exists? So in the Grand River, for example, the Conservation Authority generally engaged with one individual to represent the 6 nations of the Grand River. And he was an amazing individual, but he was one person, and one person does not represent an entire community, never mind 6 distinct nations within that community. How is participation reciprocated? And reciprocation must always be defined by those participants or partners, not by the researcher. And meaning and or benefits to the community beyond the project life once you've left the community. So I apologize for going a little over time. Thank you for your attention, and I appreciate the opportunity to present to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. A lot of great information you shared with us today. For attendees, we will open up the Q&A, and there is actually one question in there already from Dionisio Niega. Great study. How do you visualize and imagine your data analysis through a water is life-based analysis?
I think I know what this question is getting at. I'm not 100% sure if I know what this question is getting at. I know Nirosh was typing an answer. I think the question is asking, how do you analyze kind of the perspectives shared in the context of water as life? So you're not analyzing water as a thing, or so there's a couple of different things here. One, we do analyses on people who are living, and we recognize the sentience of individuals. So there are ways to do analyses on human health, for example, that where we look at parts of what we call a whole human system, a whole body, right? And so the one thing is with systems thinking is you can look at components of the water, but also look at other things that maybe are not as conventional. So are we looking at the way in which the people around those waters interacts with them? Are there generally positive environments that are being created around our interactions with tourism and recreation versus maybe more strenuous interactions, for example, with industry or things like that? Like, is there a way that water might actually interpret the activities that happen around it in terms of what we might see as the impacts in the water system? That's one way of looking at that and trying to pull forward perspectives from the people who might be interpreting that in various ways. Okay, Dionisio says right on. Okay, so I'm hoping that maybe helps. I know it's 10:45. I don't want to go over time. So feel free to email me if you have any further questions, and thank you.
Absolutely. And after this session, if anyone has any questions, you can email Elaine directly or the research office at researchoffice@algomau.ca. So thank you again, Elaine, for your sharing your research with us, and we look forward to learning more about this important work. If you want to share some of those pictures, you had some great pictures of students working in the field, go ahead and share those with us and we'll put them on our website. Right now, I will ask our next presenter if she would like to share her screen and get her slide ready, and I will go ahead and introduce her. So next we have Dr. Rose Torres, who is the newest member of the School of Social Work. She's an assistant professor and she's teaching upper year social work classes this term. Please welcome Dr. Rose Torres as she presents ethics in doing research in Indigenous communities.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And thank you, Elaine, for that great study that you just shared with us. Thank you so much. And before I begin my presentation today, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Treaty 9 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of Ojibwe, Chippewa, Muskego, Algonquin, and Métis people. So my presentation today is focused on ethics of doing research in the Indigenous communities. Research as a political process looks at how local contexts matter in the process of producing knowledge. This means that people, ways of life, their values, belief system should take central role in the definition of knowledge production. This means that knowledge production should not only be a process of rationalism, but rather a process that is ethical and geared towards humanizing that's so defined as emotional and instinctual beings. As an ethical process, research calls for reimagining the immeasurability of the other in ways we come to look at participants as beyond quantification metrics. That means that rather than understanding the other, we come to visualize the other as human that is complex and beyond simplification. The act of researching the other becomes a process beyond commodification and production of the other in ways that makes researchers to disidentify with what they have been told as the only process of producing truth. This means that research as an ethical process should imagine of knowledge production beyond the industrial processing and rationalizing of the other, and instead think of ways in which we can deindustrialize the process to accommodate other ways of truths as valid. This means that histories of communities should help researchers to validate the ways in which those communities come to know what they know and the values that tie to their social being. These major conceptual frames of the how of research are fundamental aspects that I want to share with you in this presentation. Today, I represent to you the lived experiences of Aita women healers in the Philippines. While doing that, I cannot fail to ask who I am to represent these Indigenous people. This aspect of representation is political and needs deeper critical reflexivity for me to identify my ethical duties and responsibilities. Even though I grew up with a community, it is my prerogative to identify how outsider politics play a complicated politics in the representation of the people we claim to represent, either for us, why I should be the one, and whether I need to do this representational dance. I call this a dance since I should know by place in the dance if at all I am going to represent them and remain an ally. Allyship should and remain a kind of a complicated dance that makes somebody who, like me, lies within the borderline of insider and outsider. This border point is violent, and only they who are ready to sit in its discomfort can work within the complexities of this representational politics. First, being with the community does not give me straight passport of such a cultural representation. This could be such an easy route to remove myself from such complexities that is cultural and ethical. While as a human being, I may choose to remain in my comfort, I ask myself how such comfort will continue to denigrate this community that I grew up with. My comfort and appearance are political since it disappears such communities. If I fail to represent such stories to you, I am implicated in the disappearance of the community. If I present their stories without critically nuancing their stories and who I am, I remain implicated. That said, I will reiterate that a representation of the lived experience of Aita people does not mean that they cannot represent themselves. In fact, they have known how to represent themselves even outside what has dominated rational Western representation of the self. This aspect points to the fact that while they may seemingly be presented as docile and emotional, they use multiple ways of representation that go beyond dominant styling of presentation. I did this research 10 years ago, and I'm still agonizing and reflecting on how best I can ethically represent this work without denigrating and terrorizing the community of Aita women. I was a doctoral student, and the goal was to undertake a research that would empower and help the community self-determine. Such a determination of empowerment and self-determination is not without nuances. These questions are very important to us. Who am I to empower them? What would that empowerment look like? If empowerment is bringing them to the center, how would that center look like? If that center is a white center, we could be now engaging with an ethical prerogative and asking questions on how such single form of center may marginalize the margins, margins where these communities have called home. So to speak of ethics and self-representation, we need to ask how self that is to represent has been created over time, such that what may be representation of the self become representation of the other. That would mean that even stories given by them who we see as oppressed could be a representation of an account that is colonial, and as such, we need to critically reflect and engaging with the participant. Self-determination, therefore, becomes a process of reimagining research in ways that are not just provision of data to policymakers, but also how research becomes a process of mirroring communities in ways that come to raise awareness to colonial atrocities meted on them. This would ethically and politically change the ways in which we think of research, such that communities come to be brought together by the mirror image reflected on them by the research. So this places onus on the research to unite and form coalitions in ways that are non-violent and meant to bring change in the community through social capital. So the system knows exactly how to do this through laws, legislations, protocols, and other mechanisms of controls, specifically for indigenous and marginalized groups. And we have seen this happen in our society today. It is within this framework that I argue that while research process has been a violent process of misrepresenting indigenous communities continue to subvert such representation in ways that are non-violent and meant to disorganize the metrics of knowledge production through contextual arts such as healing practices. According to Torres and Nyaga, that researchers' aim is to understand and imagine themselves and others differently. There are different ways through which we come to understand, read quantitative research, and imagine who we are and our becoming, read qualitative research. In a nutshell, research is about engagement with us and others to imagine who we are and who we could become. This imagination is a research. In research is a back and forth movement from familiar to unfamiliar spaces of our being. In addition, Torres and Nyaga argue that to reimagine the research process from critical, performative, transformative, and reflexive ways help center communities' needs and aspirations as fundamental in meaning making and knowledge production. So for a while, research has been and continues to be an ivory tower beyond communities' reach. Production of knowledge has become a neoliberal process that alienates community members from the very knowledge that is supposed to emancipate them. Knowledge production is an industrial process that squeezes blood from communities without giving back. In Cagayan, they call the Aita indigenous people Aita or Agay. I use Aita in my study. The Aita people are situated in the northern part of Luzon in the Philippines. They are located in the foothill of the steep mountain on the western side of Sierra Madre. This traditional territoriality is why the Aita people have stayed until now and skewed recognition. They believe that Cagayan is where their ancestral terrain is located. This is where the ancestors were buried and where they practice their culture and traditions. This is also the place where they continue their healing practices following in the footstep of their ancestors. When Spaniards established their colony in the 19th century in the Philippines, they brought with them physicians from Spain. Indeed, the creation of public health and Western medicine were integral part of the ideology of the empire. This ideology of colonial curing is one of the justification given by colonizers on the pretext that they were bringing the best quality of life for indigenous people. The idea that Spaniards were out to save the newly found Gitans from their uncivilized way of living was planted in the minds of the indigenous people. It does not matter if the colonizers ravaged, demonized, or dehumanized the lives of indigenous people. The colonial way of curing has been used to cover up the real work of colonization. In fact, history bears witness to several diseases in different countries where colonies were established. In other words, colonial medicine was a means of achieving the goal of colonization. The role that indigenous healers have played was completely disregarded. Alfred Crosby, in the Columbian Exchange Biological and Cultural Consequences, forcefully argues that the main destructive effects of the conquistadors and other settlers was the introduction of alien animals, plants, and diseases, and that much of the project of genocide was operationally realized by these forces. In the case of North America, this led to over 5 million deaths and a radical alteration of population demographics, and subsequently paved the way for the land expropriation, such as the Manifest Destiny in the United States. Similar analyses have been done and should be expanded to include the Philippines. In some ways, the Aita were protected from earlier ravages by their comparatively remote location. Expansionism works on logic, not unlike cancer. It is sustained by uncontrollable and unsustainable growth. In this respect, it is hardly surprising that all people, including the Aita, are exposed to its acidic forces. The Aita women's work is therefore linked in the deepest ways through the connection between nature, health, and society, and is a counterpoint to what may be seen as the crisis medicine approach imposed from the West. Holmes, 2002, states that ways of knowing are not based on the limits of one's own physical sense and may include prayer, prisons, dreams, and messages from the dead. This has been affirmed by the Aita women healers who state that their healing practice does not only focus on using herbal plants, but also focuses on other ways of healing. Their extensive healing knowledge is well known in both their community and in other communities in the province of Cagayan Valley. The Aita are well respected by their own people. Their community has been recognized for the work that they have been doing. They are consulted in times of tribulation. They have been called upon to make major decisions of their community. Their healing practices remain in existence despite the presence of Western style health centers and public health practitioners in their community. They choose to use their own healing practices to cure their people. They share their knowledge of healing with others. They continue to apply their healing practices despite the dehumanization that they have suffered from the public health community at a national level. The Aita women healers believe in themselves, and their belief is a strong force in the maintenance of their identity. They believe in the efficacy of their healing knowledge despite the continuing disruption by the non-Aita people. As a researcher, I had to know their claim that they are storylines was a fundamental form of imagining their lives and how we were to produce knowledge. It was also clear that such narrative was dialogical and community-based. The act of cooking sweet potatoes became the central methodology of my study, since while they were cooking, they would have those stories which lied within indigenous epistemologies. The Aita women healers welcomed us. In fact, we were offered some of the rice cakes to eat. The act of offering the rice cake to us reminded me of vulnerability and humanism that should guide the how of doing research in the community. To that end, one can see how an exercise that was supposed to recruit members into the research process became an orientation into Aita indigenous ways of life, which I affirm should guide my methodology. Aita women healers asked me about my study. It was then that I informed them about my study. They were very excited and agreed to share with me their healing practices. I presented them with consent form to sign, which is colonial in nature. But before that, they questioned what it entailed. These aspects for asking it is a testament that while I may be representing their stories, it remains a political process that confirms that this group is not docile and that they have ways of resisting colonial encroachment. To provide me with food before such an engagement present an art of resistance that humanizes ways of producing knowledge in ways that are dialogical and non-violent. As much as they experience challenges in their life because of the scarcity of resources and the continued domination of imperialism, the Aita remain as strong as a community in facing the different adversaries in their daily lives. The study allowed me to hear about their perspectives on healing and its implication in relation to the academic discourse. I also realized that researchers such as myself can never impose the preeminent methodology in conducting research among this community. Allowing participants to co-determine which methodology to employ led to a much more meaningful dialogue between me and the Aita healers. As Graveline states, and I quote, reminds us that to speak is a privilege, that spoken thoughts, words are sacred, and I quote. My engagement with the Aita women healers helped me reflect on my position as a researcher who had been immersed in a Eurocentric discourse, because there was a possibility that I could unknowingly use my position to oppress them. My engagement with them helped me to critically reflect on my privileges, prestige, and power, and how this could be used as oppressive tools in representing the agency and identity of the Aita women healers. The research set a scope of seeing the external world demonizes the Aita women healers. It enabled me to provide representation from their perspectives. This is because they allowed me to hear and to write about their knowledge on healing and its implication for the academy after internalizing the discussion. This helped me understand that the importance of honoring their knowledge and being consistent with their worldview. This is particularly important in this study as it was the Aita women healers who had helped me select the methodology for gathering information. In this study, the research embarked on a new production of knowledge that highlights the healing practices of Aita women. This study reveals that indigenous knowledge is an important part in both the political and academic discourses. It is a study that provides new material for the grasping of the production, the determination of literature, and a research about the conditions of women. The Aita women healers also told me that others who would subsequently listen to me would listen as if it was their voices that they were listening to. Furthermore, the women healers were emphatic that trying to write down notes while they were speaking was ineffectual because at times, whatever they would be telling me would not be able to be translated into words, but rather communicated through actions. I listened attentively and asked about their healing practices. We also talk about identity, agency, and representation. They told me that if I had any questions, I could ask them. I felt the support of Aita women healers. Their smiles always reassured me that I would be fine in this journey. I went home and transcribed all that I had heard. I also write my own reflection and observation on the things that had said. I situated myself in the Aita community as a student who was ready to learn and to be taught. I took this experience to unlearn the things that I had heard about the Aita and replace such prejudices with the knowledge that I have received from the Aita women healers. Indeed, this experience has shaped my way of theorizing, writing, and researching about indigenous peoples. I hope that this study will not only challenge our way of thinking about the Aita women, but that it will also reorient our Eurocentric gaze with respect to indigenous contributions to the academy, the political arena, and public health. Analysis was also guided by the data collection in ways that rather than me asking them close-ended questions, I also allowed them to introspect what they have said. This process of differentiation of data collect and analysis in itself colonial and marks those who do analysis as the expert and who data is collected as consumers and emotional beings. This dualism in terms of research process serve the capital in ways that analysis comes to be given more prominence and data collection become a process that is touristic and dehumanizing. And so to decolonize such a process is to call ways in which participants take central role in both collection and analysis of data in ways that decolonizes this dualism. I will end this presentation that we therefore call for an engaged process of engaging participants in research in ways that humanize and make them control of their life through research. This helps make research as critically reflective and ready to mix the blood and the mincemeat in ways that go beyond the normalized process of making knowledge. The methodologies of research and practice help imagine communities beyond their everyday experiences and start acknowledging how such experiences both resist and uncouple colonial boundaries of knowledge production. Through a critically reflexive research process, research takes an ethical tangent in ways that identify everybody as having the power to produce knowledge. Ethical obligation is a fundamental necessity of any critical reflexive research. As Lavina would say, we come to engage with the face of the other in ways that mark us late. This means that the role of the researcher as the knower of the other is flawed and contradictory and steals the life out of communities. For researchers to be ethically responsible, they will have to come to terms with the fact that they cannot understand the face of the other. Rather, they can only imagine and acknowledge the pain of the other. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Rose, for your presentation. For the attendees, I have opened up the Q&A function. So if anybody has any questions they would like to ask of Rose, you can hover at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A button that you can open and ask your question, and I will read that to Rose. And again, all presentations will be recorded, and we will share them and post them on the AU Research Week website. In case anybody was unable to attend any of the events, they can still go and view the presentation. And I don't seem to see any questions. Again, oh, Donna is asking one. When you publish the results of this kind of work, how do you acknowledge and include the Indigenous participants in an ethical and meaningful way?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Rogers. In fact, publishing the data or the knowledge of Indigenous, Aita Indigenous women is problematic to me. However, in my conversation with them in the Philippines, I asked their permissions. And one way of including them in the publication is to include their narratives. And in that narratives, I make sure that I put pseudonyms, and those pseudonyms I also ask there. It's a very, and to tell you frankly, it's to decolonize the way of researching and to decolonize the way of in terms of representation is a very, very, very difficult process. And so the only way I can do is to ask permission from the Aita people and ask, you know, if they want me to include their narratives, and if they say, go ahead, include, I include them. But most of the time, like I said, I did that research 10 years ago, and I'm still agonizing how I can best represent the, you know, the lives of Aita women healers. So, you know, I use their narratives. And in fact, I have been publishing them, and every time I publish, every time I write you know, a paper, I always tell them that this is what's happening, and I hope that you give me permission. And some of them say, "Go ahead, Rose, let's do this." So with that kind of engagement that I have been having with the Aita women healers in the Philippines, I was able to include them in the publications. So, but again, I like I said, it is not easy how you incorporate the narratives of Indigenous people from you know, from a colonial perspective. Like publication is, as we all know, before you can publish something, it will go through, you know, a process of peer review and all these kind of things. And you don't even know if these people who are reviewing the paper have, you know, have knowledge on the people that you're talking about. So there are many nuances in terms of how do you incorporate, you know, the narratives of Indigenous people in the things that you do. And like I said, it has been a very difficult process for me, and every time I present their narratives, it's always a, you know, a challenge. And like the only way I can do is to explain to them, to have an engagement with them, and to say, this is what I've been doing, and what do you think about this paper? And is it okay with me or okay with you to be included in this paper? And if they say yes, go ahead, I will do it. But again, it hasn't been an easy journey for me. And also, like I said, without them who helped me finish this dissertation, I wouldn't be here right now talking about them, and maybe wouldn't be in the academy. And because of their of their assistance, because of their help, because of their knowledge that they shared with me, I am here with you. But it has been a difficult process. But the good thing is, one of the reason why I did this also is, they have been represented in in different textbook, that they don't have culture, they don't have ways of life. They are, they are savage because they are indigenous people in the Philippines. So when I approached them the first time and I told them that I'm planning to do a study with them with their permission, they said it is high time, because if we don't do this, then there's no way we can counteract the different things that have been written about us. So, but again, it's a difficult process, and it's always been a difficult process on how to include them in my everyday engagement, in my writing, in my research, because there is always, that colonial practice of how, and then try to decolonize it, and making sure that the tools that we use in decolonizing our work are not colonial in nature is an everyday engagement, and it is a process.
Thank you, Rose. We actually have two more questions. One from Elaine. Can you expand on the idea of the research position as a position of potential harm from an ethics perspective? Example, strategies you would suggest for reflecting on your role as a researcher to become more aware of this, or strategies for being more intentional about being ethical, broadly defined?
Very good questions. Again, we have to ask ourselves, what is ethics? What is being ethical? From what perspective? Because if we define ethics from our perspective, then maybe it's not an ethical to the indigenous people. So when I conduct research in the indigenous community, I make sure that they determine every steps of the way, especially the methodology, especially how do we ask questions, what kind of questions do we need to ask? Because again, I teach ethics in the School of Social Work, and when you look at the definition of ethics, you cannot define ethics from the perspective of right and wrong, or what is moral and what is not moral. From what perspective? So we have to keep asking ourselves, from what perspective are we using when we do this kind of research in the indigenous community? And the idea of I do this research in the indigenous community is already, it is already colonial in nature. So what I did within the indigenous community is to ask questions, and not only asking questions, to listen to them, and to use make sure that they they are part in making sure the development of the research. And most of the time is I cannot even use the word allow, because who am I to allow them to be involved in my research? Is them to lead me in making sure that the research is be conducted in their community. So again, doing research, in fact, the way they define research is the dirtiest word. When they define research, is a dirtiest word, because most of the time, researchers, they go to the community, take away their knowledge, and yes, they will incorporate their name, but in the process of analysis, the narratives of indigenous people is gone. So So again, my advice to non-Indigenous researchers is, even before you do the research, you have to have engagement with the Indigenous community. And this engagement is not just one engagement, go and ask and say yes. It should be a continuous engagement, and to build a relationship with the Indigenous people, because research is been implicated in in violating the life or the culture or the Indigenous people. And so this is a continuous engagement that we are doing. We're trying to, how do we conduct research in the Indigenous community in a way that is non-violent in nature? So again, I don't have a prescription on how to do research in the Indigenous community. And the only, my advice is, the only way to do it is to go to the community and ask the community on how to do research in their community. And because if we determine how to do research in the community or within the Indigenous community, we are again doing it from a colonial perspective, which is unethical in nature. So again, ethics should be guided by the Indigenous community and not by the researcher, because if you do that, then we are violating their culture, their lives, their community practices, and so many things.
Thank you, Rose. And we have one more question from Dionisio Niega. Great touching on research and the face of the other, and how to understand the face of the other. What were some challenges in reading Aida women healers' faces?
The challenges, there are so many challenges. And like I said, one of them is I have been educated from a Eurocentric schools. The narratives or the understanding that I had from about the Aita people is so colonial. So in fact, the first time I know this group, and I grew up within the community. And of course, there is a question, and why are you going back to the group or to the community and doing the research? Because I want to know more about them. And so the challenges is coming from the West and have all these degrees from the West. Just by looking at their face, I was very confused already, because all the methodologies, all the the protocols, the processes on how to do research is from a colonial perspective. So now to do a research in the in the Aita community, having all those kind of tools that is colonial, that are colonial in nature, are already very problematic. And so it wasn't an easy experience. And so the challenges was just by, because when we talk about the face, we are not talking about the face literally, just the face. It is about their lives. It is about their culture. It's about their way of life. It's about their histories in terms of colonization and the continuous discrimination, dehumanization by the Aita people. So face is not about their face literally. Again, it is about acknowledging that Indigenous people have experience of colonization, and this colonization cannot be forgotten, because the moment we forget the history of colonization, then we end up doing an unethical research. Because now what happened is, I remember when I went there the first time, I was so excited, and I told them I am a PhD student with so much pride, and the elder told me, aha, you're a PhD student, tell me more about it. And so when I was telling them about my study, they said, whatever you're telling us is not acceptable in our community. And so then how do you balance on doing a research from a university from the West and now going back to the community? So which one? Because if you don't follow the process and protocols from the university, and you want to do a research in the community, then you may end up not getting your degree. But you have the calling of doing a research in the community. How do you do this? So that's one of the challenge. So how did I do it? I have to ask them to help me. I have to ask the Aita people. I have to ask their guidance. So they became my professors in the end. They became my supervisors in the end. They became the people who teach me on how to do research. So all the things that I've learned from the West, it was all, changed into from their own perspective. It was a difficult process. And so right now, I still don't have answers to those kind of questions of how do you do research in the community of Aita people when you do not, when you are an outsider. And so it's still, every time I present this research, I feel the pain in my chest because my God, I'm not really doing the right thing here. And so every time I do this presentation, it's a way of engaging with you on on the mistakes that I've done, and hoping that from those mistakes I can do better in my research, because research has been implicated in the denigration of the community of Indigenous people. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you, Rose. Looks like that concludes our Q&A for today. And again, if anybody has any questions or comments for Rose, you can send them directly to her or to researchoffice@algomau.ca, and we will get those forwarded to her. So again, I'd like to thank both Elaine and Rose for sharing your research projects and experiences in conducting that research with us today. This will be very helpful to our faculty and students as they embark on their own research projects. And that concludes our Indigenous Research Spotlight. I'd like to thank you all for attending today. A reminder that we have our first lunchbox talk beginning at 11:45 today, and we have another spotlight tomorrow, on Thursday, on community-based research that begins at 10 a.m. Thank you again, and we hope to see you throughout the rest of the week.
Thank you, Elaine. Oh, thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.